One of my favorite ongoing tropes surrounding dwarves is the idea of memory and how it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. I mean, you have things that are classic dwarves, right? Tradition. And not just normal tradition, but tradition that can feel as binding as any legal document. We see this specifically within Age of Sigmar in the Fire Slayers, the dwarven who value tradition, devotion, and order. Like, not just good guy order, but an order to their universe, too. Memory could also manifest itself by legality, memorizing written rules, where the idea of cultural memory is displayed in how well you can recall and manipulate agreed upon rules, things that are tangibly written down. This is the way of the Caradhran overlords, who came together and made a codified society, and then expanded their culture and worldview based on that understanding. And heck, if you go all the way back to the old world, famously with those dwarves, you have the Book of Grudges, right? The quintessential memory tome, a tome whose whole purpose was to remember the slights against your people, your kingdom, whatever. And we bring this conversation now back to the Helsmiths of Hashut, because each of those other dwarf factions splintered and took the concept of memory, this theme within them, and put it under a new lens. Everything changed once the world fell apart. So, how did the Zardron, the Helsmiths of Hashut, bring this idea of memory in? Well, their societal system, tongue twister there, is really what's called the wage of toil. This is essentially the debt that you owe to the others around you. If you are born in a ziggurat, you owe something to your lords for the home, the food, the water. If you study under a demon smith, you owe them for using their equipment, their resource, gaining their knowledge. In fact, you are worth whatever people can leverage against you. This is essentially your record of deeds, because you have to have something going on if you have all these different hands in different pots around the society, and this forms its own power economy. Let's say, for example, that the council on the Forge Anathema wants a Stormcast settlement wiped out. One of these council members might say, hey, I know just the dwarven for this. It's Dag Grax, Demon Smith Extraordinaire. I'm making this up as I go. And so they come to Dag and they say, hey Dag, go take over that city and we will shower you in treasure afterwards. And you can keep what you plunder. Well, Dag is going to bust out his, Rolodex on his desk to all the people who owe him. His subordinates, his family, subsidiary forges, all the people who have either let him down or need to build some street cred, all of it. And he's going to call in all those favors. That is him tapping into the other person's wage of toil, and that forms his army. He'll have demon smiths under his tutelage. Maybe a forge sends a few dominator engines. Maybe one acolyte wants to test a new cannon, ammunition formula. And you collect the force that you need to do the job. This is how society moves up and down. It's about the value you bring and what you can be called upon to bring to somebody else, due to this kind of mutual debt system. Which is why the goal is always to be at the top, where you owe very little to anyone else and you get to call in all the favors because you are doing all the leading. And I explained this key aspect of the Helsmiths of Hashut worldview because we're going to crack into the individual units within this book. Now, to be honest, there are not many units in this book. It is a somewhat small army, and not every entry is even an essay. Some are just like 2 paragraphs, but I do find them compelling because as one unit builds upon another, a picture begins to form of all these dwarves who are stuck in this cycle of subjugation to another. Maybe I don't want to do X, but I have to because I owe the boss. And once I'm the boss, I have to do terrible things to maintain my position so I don't have to go back down and do worse things. And so we're going to start our character coverage at the top, working through the heroes, and then jump down to the bottom. So at the top of any given Helsmiths of Hashut army are the Demon Smiths. Just as the holds of the old world had kings, or hold fathers, or so on, so too the Zardron are led by the few at the top. In fact, the early demon smiths who solidified their position were holdovers from the original dwarven kings that existed before the Age of Chaos. And the reason is very practical. At the top, you have the resources to call upon, to build, to research, to share innovations that you bring forward. And as the early dwarves had to dabble in these demon-infused weapons, the person who could afford the most of them to learn was obviously the guy at the top. And this also applies to the arcane knowledge and research that separates, the lords from the nobodies. When you are at the top in terms of resources and also in terms of technology and stuff, you can hire cabals to go out and hunt rare ingredients or valuable metals, or despoil specific places for a ritual site. So it makes like a very natural transition from, hold fathers into demon smiths. And while the vast majority, just by sheer numbers, of demon smiths can walk on the battlefield, the real way to show off is to ride in on an infernal Taurus. Essentially, each of these is the graduate thesis for becoming a professional or renowned demon smith. Each infernal Taurus is a sculpture made from precious metals like jade or I know jade's not a metal, but you know what I mean? Like there's different materials like inlaid with special gems and gold and all kinds of stuff. The entire thing is coated in runes, and you just build this really beautiful statue, and then you do all kinds of terrible rituals to it to entice/force demons inside of it. And it's like have the statue sink into a gore pile, or you bleed 1,000 things onto its head, that kind of stuff. And once it's full of demons, you close the proverbial lid. Now, if you do it correctly, this is a statue that will sit on the main entrance hall of the Demon Smith as a proud display and master of craftsmanship and that kind of stuff. All the while, there's literally demons screaming inside of it who are trapped and trying to get out. Now, at the Demon Smith's command, this statue can animate and use those spirits kind of like as an animus to become the Infernal Taurus, and he can use it as a steed into battle. And it's this kind of cool unliving war machine. It forces demons to animate an avatar of your supposedly non-demonic god into battle. It's super rad. And this is actually a dual kit that comes with the named version, our bro Urak-Tar. But I want to cover his story separately and pick apart the rise of a demon smith in modern Helsmith culture. So that'll be my next AOS one. But regardless, he is an example of a demon smith representing the highest tier of leadership, and has a council of other demon smiths beneath him to oversee the day-to-day tasks. And as a note for a lore nerd like me, the rarity of infernal Tauruses is not discussed. Like some of these really cool centerpiece models, they'll say something like, generally there's only one in battle, or they're so rare you would never see two of them kind of a thing. This has no such deal. If you want 3, take 3. Now, below the Demon Smiths are the kind of sub-tiers of leadership. Ideally, the Demon Smiths are building wonders all day and making huge batches of armaments and all kinds of stuff. And these other heroes are managing the details, as a representative for their betters. These essentially fall into 3 broad categories: the War Despots, the Ashen Elders, and what I'm going to call the lesser demon smiths. Let's start with the easy one, the demon smiths. Essentially, it's just a war scroll for the dude without a mount. But I put it here because we only have one war scroll to represent a wide range of skills, expertise, and knowledge. We know that there are apprenticeships that last lifetimes. We know that there is a range of magical abilities, that a fair few of these demon smiths on foot will not achieve much, but were raised with the opulence that made them useful. Again, they have a wage of toil that can be called upon even if they don't show personal acumen and greatness. If we were comparing the Helsmiths to, say, like the warp forges of the Skaven, your infernal Taurus riders are your warlocks, and your boys on foot are like the warlock bombardiers, and probably carry out much of the same role, right? They do the unfun parts of research and development. Next to them are the War Despots. This is your middle manager gone Super Saiyan, okay, in terms of bringing suffering into your life. Many of them come from the noble clans of the old houses. They're rich and famous enough to earn status and responsibility, but not the wealth or aptitude to get into the world of demon smithing. Right? You can be a really exceptional forge manager, hold father, whatever you want to call yourself. Your title can be whatever. But if you just don't have the natural acumen or inclination to get into magic, this is where you'll end up. And this role of war despot can be filled by characters from a lot of different backgrounds. The book names a few. They can be elders looking to get into more brutal fights to feel something. They've been around for forever, so now they just like the brutality of it. They can be ambitious upstarts who volunteer for these tasks to earn glory and trying to raise themselves up the ladder. They could be industrialists taking command of an army to sack an area, or factory managers leading a party to get supplies so that a quota can be met. What they have in common is their willingness to lead the charge. It is unseemly for dwarves or dwarven to lead from the back, right? No one would respect a KO captain or a rune father who shirks from combat, and the same applies to these dwarves. The demon smiths delivered a mission, and I'm the hero who will deliver. Who's with me? That's the vibe we get from the war despot. He is your military war leader. And lastly are the Ashen Elders, and these kind of meet the spiritual needs of the faction. Remember for a moment how personally Duarden take their relationship with the divine. The Fireslayers have been spending centuries desperately looking to put Grimnir back together before, during, and after the Age of Chaos. The Karajan overlords were so bitter about being abandoned by Grugni that they want nothing to do with him, because thousands of dwarven holds called for help, and this god answered none of them. Except for Hashut. And you can see why this would foster such zealous dedication. However, Hashut, even though he's personal and delivers on that aspect of what these dwarves want, he is a very demanding deity, so the book says. He wants his forges to never stop. He wants constant sacrifices, blood rituals, offerings, that kind of thing. Now, it's not like he's a chaos god in the sense of he has like a particular energy or vibe that feeds him, like warfare is Khorne and despair is Nurgle, that kind of stuff. Hashut is presumably not a chaos god and doesn't have a specific thing, but the demand is still there, and I think it's because it's still empowering Hashut in some way. Well, the Ashen Elders exist in a delicate balance between the Demon Smiths, because they are both representing Hashut in a capacity, and so they need each other, right? The Demon Smiths are representing Hashut's war aims and his goals and his direction, whereas the Ashen Elders represent Hashut in the spiritual sense of keeping him animated and relevant in the culture. They need each other. That said, this is not a society that's great at sharing the pie. It helps that they're generally pulled from the same stock, like, Duarden nobles within the society, but it's beneath this tier of leadership where things really open up. Because once you have your point person, your leader here, everything below them is simply a matter of what they could get access to complete the job. So, for example, a force could be one war despot and his prized dominator engine, or it could be an entire factory's worth of Duarden pulled from the work line, given a gun, and sent to conquer. Now that's the leadership of the army. I want to pause here. As we talk about the rest of the units, I want to start at the bottom and work our way up. It makes sense to start with the leadership to understand how the wage of toil, functions, but how it applies to the units, I think, makes much more sense if you go from the least among them to the most. So, in order from chumps to champs, what forces does an aspiring war despot like you and I have to access to? Well, it gets no lower on the corporate org chart than the Hobgrot Vandals. These are diminutive creatures, bigger than a normal grot, like you see in the Gloomspite Gits, but smaller than an orc. And we've seen them quite a bit before. Specifically, they are a key unit in the Cruel Boys line of miniatures. And they're just little guys who run around and hope to die hard enough to make a difference. And they largely fill the same role within this army. But how are they different? Technically, they are not. There was a time where the Cruel Boys bought a bunch of metals and gunpowder from the Helsmiths of Hashut, sometime back in the Age of Chaos, I believe. And the Hobgrots acted as the mules and the means to facilitate these deals, bringing things back and forth. This is all in exchange for, munitions, and then the Cruel Boys would give them food and magics and other resources, that kind of stuff. Well, this deal that they had famously fell through and began an event known as the War of Broken Promises, where the Helsmiths of Hashut and the Cruel Boys both accused each other of betrayal, and it ended with a massive Cruel Boy assault on Zorn that was quickly swatted down real hard. That said, the Hobgrots had already begun to proliferate between the two factions. And since Hobgrots are similar to Skaven in that they are all convinced of their own superiority and cunning, they started making deals. Some were happy to go work as laborers for the Helsmiths. If the Orc clans were bad enough, what did you have to lose? So they stay with the dwarves for the same reason they hung out with the orcs, who beat them, right? It's just safer than being out there on your own. But there are some Hobgrots that see real opportunity here because some of them will steal precious scraps of metal or something like that in service to their new master, and so that's what you're seeing on the battlefield. They're just grabbing any sharp things they can find on the ground and rushing at the enemy with them. Next up on the list are the Infernal Cohorts. These represent the basic Helsmith infantry that is actually dwarven. Right? It's much more in line with the faction's origins, bringing them closer to the old world dwarves, and in fact these operate like the clans of old. A unit of Infernal Cohort, as we know them, is most likely related to one another, either raised in or married to a family clan. Your value as a leader is how many warriors you can bring to your banner, which is a direct demonstration of your ability to feed and equip that many family members. So if your cousin is a noble and needs something done, he may take the role of a war despot and call in a family favor to recruit you and your immediate kin to the fight. You win, you get paid, and you've deducted that value from your wage of toil. And despite them being ostensibly evil, they are most treated like old world warriors amongst the dwarven clans. I mean that in comparison to how the typical dwarf is in the Carriage and Overlords or the Fire Slayers. So these guys are obsessively maintaining their gear and keeping it perfectly clean. They function together as a whole, meaning a perfect mechanism. Every spear thrust is in rhythm, every shield wall push is perfectly synchronized. And while these are very selfish and individualistic dwarven, and while they'll happily stab you in the back off the battlefield, it is just seen as too inefficient to be practical during battle. So there's kind of this built-in code, which I love, right? We're not Skaven. I'm at least going to wait until the fight is over to kill you. Even this, the most lowly foot soldiers of the Helsmiths of Hashut, is equipped with demon-forged weapons and arms. And that manifests on the table by being able to imbue demonic power to nearby allies. One tier up from there are the Infernal Razors, and rather than being grouped together along kinsman lines like your clan would, these are more like grad students who all want to show off their work. And you're put in a group together to basically keep them organized by the school counselor. What I mean is, some of the dwarven have been fighting for decades, and the cohorts may get an idea for a new weapon or a concept for some kind of innovation. You have a bright idea. You don't have to be of noble birth to have an idea. And if it pans out, you can bring this idea to your demonsmith or war despot above you and elevate your stature, amongst the whole forge or your clan at least. So on their off hours, some of these dwarven, who can come from any background, toil on their inventions, whatever their idea was, and on the day of battle, they bring them all out. Again, organized into groups, what we recognize as units, and this lets the people kind of group same designs together so that we can really see who has the best design of these drills, or who has the best cannon design, or something like that. The Infernal Razors all come into battle with these little funny hats, which really just make them stand out, because that's how you know that they're testing something. They bring their mad scientist experiments out to the battle, trying to outdo one another, so that they are proven the best design and thus elevated. Again, you're trying to earn your way up to Demonsmith. Now, of note right now, we have two main categories of the Infernal Razors, and those are the Grismalock Blunderbusses and the Cragthorn Flame Hurlers. Wow, that's a real hard one to say for me. The Blunderbuss is exactly what you think. It's a big ol' hand cannon. While the Flame Hurler is sort of like a highly focused flamethrower. It shoots Demon Flame, which has a kind of a low bit of sentience to it, and so it It kind of shows up in the Tzeentch book too, but imagine if a fire was sentient enough to try and spread. So it's like lashing out all of your clothing, trying to be as hard to put out as possible. And that is it for infantry. Our next option here is the bull centaur. And one thing that this book hits home is that many Helsmiths of Hashut are marked by mutation, which is very abnormal for dwarven, who generally boast a natural resistance to mutation. These babies are known as the Doom Marked, and they are swiftly taken from their families by the Ashen Elders and things like that. And there's a kind of a big mystery here. It's unknown if the mutations are happening because of their devotion to Hashut, or as a result of just interacting with these materials. Like, is the god making us evil and that's why we're changing, or is it just like kind of how a small town that doesn't have understanding of radiation would be poisoned by what they're working with? And while there's a bunch of different kinds of mutations vaguely alluded to that I assume will come out as future units, nothing specific, they just said there's a lot of different kinds, only one kind of mutant is allowed to exist in society as of now. That is the bull centaur. And that is simply because it has the aspect of their deity. These are exactly what they sound like. It's a bull, but instead you lop off its head and you throw the upper half of a dwarven up there from the torso up. They also have some other mutations like tusks and stuff like that. And they form the Scorched Sect, which is the religious arm, or the militant arm, of the Helsmiths of Hashut. They're kind of spoiled because, they're seen as divine manifestations and treated as such, lavish gifts upon them and such. Urzorn is famous for having more than any other forge. And like I said, the book leaves a lot of room for other kinds of mutants to exist. Along with them in the dual kit are the Anointed Sentinels, and this is sort of the masked bull centaur option. Essentially, these are bull centaurs, but while most of that kind of creature just loves battle and smashing into things, some feel a higher calling. They almost buy into the idea that they are some kind of divine being. And so their response is to lean into that religiosity, lean into the temple, the religious structure. So Anointed Sentinels are like bull centaurs that want to be paladins for Hashut, mostly acting defensively, but once in combat they bring a religious zeal to the slaughter that the bull centaurs don't. Next up is the Desolation Batteries. This is a catch-all term for any of the mobile artillery platforms used by the Helsmiths. They could be firing either Deathstreaker rockets or a Tormentor bombard. So the Deathstreaker rocket battery, which is the missile pod thing, each of those missiles, when fired, gives off a deafening shriek, hence the name of the actual thing, and every missile is made with industrial runoff from the forges and possesses that same sentient fire that we mentioned earlier. So it's used primarily as an anti-infantry weapon, but it can mess some stuff up like a tree lord real fast. It's perfect for scorching an area. The alternative here is the Tormentor Bombard, and this is the cannon that just points up to God, right? It just lobs a ball of chaos energy directly into the sky to then arc down and come on top of an enemy. Now the ammunition itself is sort of a copper-looking sphere with blue flames swirling inside of it, and when it hits the ground, first of all, the ground immediately around it is vitrified, and it pulses out a highly disorienting magical effect to anything around its kind of radius of impact. So disorientation just as much as there is destruction. And I've saved the best for last, which is my favorite miniature, the Dominator Engines. Which, for being my favorite unit, does not have a ton of lore, but these are essentially automata that have a bunch of demon souls jammed into them with their own furnace to kind of keep them going. They act somewhere between, Battle Engine and Wicker Man, both destroying the enemy, but also kind of being perceived as this living avatar of Hashut at the same time. It is certainly the best, if we're thinking the Wicker Man representation or whatever, that's that kind of thing. It's an idol. And so let's take a step back here at the end and ask the question, why is this cool? We have the setup for some very interesting storytelling here. You have a mix of a technocracy and a mageocracy. You have noble families leading the masses. There is a tension between the religious sect and other power bases, And the aristocrats that can make a name for themselves can be in any single one of those, which has a whole bunch of, family tension and drama and that kind of stuff. It's the real rock bed fodder for great stories. Now, if I'm honest, I was a bit disappointed on how small the faction was. Like, for example, what if there was a factory floor boss who kept all the infantry, fighting in sequence? Or maybe a 2 dwarven weapon team of some kind. I wish they were able to flesh out some of the ideas a little bit more. Kind of like, we already mentioned the Skaven a little bit, but how they have multiple types of engineers. I would really like to see this faction fleshed out that way. The units outlined here are enough to represent the lore, which is important. I'm just saying there's an immense amount of room here to grow. I would love to hear if you are a Helsmith fan or not, what kind of units would you add? For me personally, I'm thinking like one of my favorite kind of archetypes here that would be relevant is wizard units. So like you have a unit that is 3 essentially minor demon smiths, and maybe they just aren't as good, but if you crank them up to 11 with demonic power, they can do something cool. Something that kind of represents that in-between leadership of, your factory worker and the tier of leadership above them. It just seems so vast in the model range. But I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will catch you next time. Happy wargaming, friends!